Hey, friend, welcome to the living room. I'm glad you're here. I believe you're going to be blessed by today's conversation. Would you do me a favor? Press that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, like this video, and share it with family and friends so they too can be inspired here in the living room. Enjoy today's conversation. Welcome to the living room where we listen, learn, and live together. I'm your host, Richard Martin. Make yourself right at home. I'm glad you're here. By now, it's no secret. I'm a church kid. What I mean by that is a significant portion of my upbringing involved my local church. And when I look back, the primary communication strategy then consisted of, words of announcement printed in bulletins with waterfalls on the front, and those that were shared from the podium by my pastor or the church clerk. But the church that I pastor now, whereas it still maintains some of those nostalgic elements, in many ways, it is fading away. It's a completely new day. The message of Jesus Christ is still the same, but the avenues with which we communicate that, they're changing at a breakneck speed. To say it's overwhelming is an understatement. Perhaps you can relate to that. And if you can, then our special guest feels your pain. He sits at the intersection of culture, tech, and church, helping people like you and me lean in and serve meaningfully where we are with what we have to begin with. And he's the leader, the founder of Pro Church Tools, which is a ministry dedicated to helping us navigate the greatest shift the church has seen in the past 500 years. I want you to lean in and listen and help me welcome our special guest, Mr. Brady Shearer. What's going on, Brady?
Appreciate that kind intro, Richard. Great to be here. Great to be with your audience.
No problem. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for just hanging out with us today. So from the top, I want to just get right into it. So we'll kind of go forward and backwards a little bit and kind of all around. What is the greatest shift the church has had to navigate in the past 500 years?
Sure. It's the advent of the internet and digital media. And the 500 years prior communication shift is the printing press. And the printing press obviously had dramatic consequences for the Christian church. Prior to the printing press, you wouldn't be able to have a copy of the Word of God for yourself, right? You would have to go to the local parish, the priest, the pastor. They would disseminate the Word to you. The printing press made it affordable for the everyday person to have a copy of the Scriptures in their own home, which gave them the ability to read it for themselves. This was very important in ushering the Protestant Reformation. And we're seeing something similar now. A lot of us, you grew up in a church, you mentioned that, Richard, we can relate to that feeling of being in a Christian bubble. Well, the internet exposes us to worldviews outside of that Christian bubble now much earlier. And so for generations like ourselves, the millennials, for the generation behind us, Gen Z, we're seeing dramatic shifts in faith in what I like to call cultural Christianity. And the internet is playing a huge role in that, and it can be a negative. The internet also provides opportunities that have never, ever existed in the history of humankind for faith leaders and for churches, which is, of course, a huge positive. So navigating it can be tricky. The work my company and I do is all about helping church leaders make sense of it all.
So where many in our generation are kind of throwing up the peace sign to the church, or at least certain iterations of church as it has been, instead, you have chosen to kind of lean in and say, you know what, I think that there's a lot that maybe deserves commentary and at times maybe even criticism. But instead of walking away, at some point in your life, you made a choice that I'm going to lean in and seek to affect change from within. What led to this decision for you personally? Why are you still here, simply put, and why are you working for the cause that you're working for?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our generation, millennials, have popularized the term deconstruction. a term that many of us know intimately well. A lot of people can interpret the idea of deconstruction as something that was motivated by being exposed to worldviews outside of the church. Something that spawns with, you go off to college and you start getting involved in things that, your Christian parents or your church leaders didn't want you to. I think it is actually usually spawned by our own experiences within the church. So I've seen a lot of my friends talk about their negative experiences in the church, and I have plenty of my own. I know some of my friends that have moved on. Been like, you know what? There's nothing here that's redeemable. It's not for me. And then I know myself and many more that have said, yeah, there have been real issues and there's been real harm done. But for many of us, we had our formative years in the church. And some of my fondest memories of church are youth ministry. And I wanted to be a youth pastor when I went off to Bible college. That's what I have my degree in, theology and youth ministry, because my time at church as an adolescent was so largely positive. There were negative experiences, certainly, but largely positive. And for me, I found like belonging really for the first time as, an awkward teenager, like so many of us can relate to. That belonging was found in the church. And so for as much harm has been done by the church, mostly the North American church, the Western church, I don't want to lump in the Eastern church into this. There's still something so powerful, valuable, and, something of existential need that everyone can relate to. And that's why I'm still here. That's why I do have a critical voice sometimes. What happens when the church gets criticized a lot is, and this happens to anyone that gets criticized a lot, is you get yourself into a defensive posture because it's really just instinctual. People are criticizing me, I'm going to get in a defensive posture. And then what happens is you tend to make excuses for things that have gone wrong. You tend to cover up things that you don't want the outside world to see because they're already being so critical. If they saw this, it would only get worse. But what that does is it ends up allowing that harm to perpetuate and to evolve and transcend, make it into another generation. I think we're in a critical point right now. We can see the statistics from Barna. Practicing Christians in the last decade down considerably. Those that attend church in the last decade down considerably. We're not going to say that correlation is causation, but what also happened in the last 10 years? Well, that was the advent of the internet and social media and digital media for the everyday person. Facebook became open to the public in 2007, 2008. And so many of the platforms that we're now a part of our everyday lives, and it's hard to imagine living without them, have only been a part of our everyday lives for 10 years. And so it's a very turbulent period. It's a very volatile period. And then, hey, let's inject a pandemic. Let's get real crazy with it.
Yeah. Why not?
But I think it is a moment in time where, the church can acknowledge some of her wrongdoings and work to repair and to continue the great work that the church does, even amongst some of the harm and abuse and, all the domineering and, plenty of things that have happened.
Sure. And I appreciate you taking us not only your personal journey, but also kind of summarizing a very real part of the history. I think any institution loves to put forth its best foot and to advertise all of its wins. And when it comes to those L's, you're right. We can adopt a posture of defensiveness. And where there's defensiveness, I think beneath it, there are a number of things. Sometimes it's a bit of pride. Sometimes it's a bit of insecurity. And then sometimes there's just really a lack of know-how. How do I approach the pathway of repentance to acknowledge, hey, there's some real faults, as you mentioned, in the North American Western church. I think in many ways that is what our generation and subsequent generations, Gen Z, are responding to, that what we were called to was to provide allegiance in many ways, not always, but in many ways was to, an institution, a certain way of doing. And I think that in many ways is what some of our peers are saying, listen, I don't want anything to do with that. And I love how you've shared, yes, some of that is connected to church hurt and then a number of other things. But I also think there's a wonderful opportunity to say, well, let's really get down to it. If the church attendance is declining, and I pastor a church, the average age of attendees, consistent regular attendees, is 55 plus, like many modern churches, postmodern churches. In terms of 2021 looks a lot different than 1981, 1971, even 1991. And I wrestle with this professionally because I have to think, okay, what does my own work livelihood look like in the next 10 or 15 years? And I wanted to ask this question just kind of as a transition. Do you think it's possible, we're thinking, imagining out loud here, that we could see a day where there are pastors and church leaders who serve faith communities, locally speaking now, that don't have a physical plant? Is that a possible thing, or is it already happening? Are there pastors and church leaders who lead and serve congregations, but there's no physical plant that they attend as a hub? Is that something that you think could come in the future?
I don't think so. I struggle with that idea. I would be likely considered by many churches and pastors as like one of the front runners for the world of digital and how it gets used in churches. And sometimes that has been misunderstood as me advocating digital can somehow, or online can somehow, replace or take the place of offline ministry. And I do not believe that whatsoever. In fact, I think that, digital plays a different role in a church context than it would be in a business context. If we think of a business as very transactional, like my business, I don't need to be in community with my customers. So we have a software platform. The people that pay for that software platform, I don't need to be in community with them. We have a transactional relationship. They pay my company money. I develop tools that are useful for them, useful enough for them to continue paying. And so all of my content marketing and the paid marketing we do, our customer support, it's all very transactional in that way. And we're an approachable company. We're friendly, of course, but that could not be farther from the day-to-day reality of an everyday church. The whole point of a church is for it to be a community. Church is at its best when you are at your lowest. There are people to come around you. When you have a crisis of faith, there are people that you can lean on. When you are celebrating the life of a new child or a marriage or your own child getting married, when things are at their best, you get a new job, you have this group of people around to celebrate with you. That is what makes church still so valuable to the everyday person. Now, what we are seeing is the commoditization of some of the traditional elements of a church service. So if your church is predicated upon an excellent message, it's predicated upon outstanding worship, there could be a vulnerability there, because I can listen to a better preacher than you. Mercy. Because there's only one best preacher in the world for everyone, and it's highly unlikely that it's your local pastor. And I can find more creative writing and better production for worship ministry with any number of worship bands that I prefer than your local church. It's just an odds game. It's highly unlikely that you attend the church that does. The reason those things have value is because of the community. And so if we try to take the community element and replicate that online, we've got it all backwards. Digital should serve as a way to get you closer to community. So our entire, what we always say to churches is like, the most important thing that you have going for you is people taking next steps. If you are going to have a motivation in your church, if you have a mission statement, it should always be motivated to get people to take more next steps. And the next step is anytime someone takes an intentional step towards Jesus. Because what we don't want are passive spectators that are sitting in our pews that are just consuming these programs and then going about their merry way. We want active spectators. That's how you affect life change, by getting that involvement. And so digital can play an integral role in motivating those next steps and getting people involved, moving people from passive spectators to that state of being an active participant. But if we're just trying to replicate community online, I don't think that's possible. I don't think that can be done.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. I raised that question out of what over the past 18 going on 24 months has been somewhat of an echo chamber where there's a lot of these kinds of questions circulating. when the pandemic took place, disrupted church as we knew it. A lot of people said this is exactly what the church is needed to be shaken up. We should have long since left the building. And this was just a portion, maybe even a vocal minority, but it caused me to reflect. And I said, well, is this where things are going? But I do agree that there is something irreplaceable about the value and the necessity, and in many ways, the theology of community, that belonging and proximity do have something to do with one another. And like many churches, we have done our due diligence to create as hospitable of an environment in a virtual setting. But we all know there's only so far that we can go with that. And so I appreciate you kind of showing us how even with digital, it has a function, but let's not get the cart before the horse. And from that, I love the wording that Pro Church Tools uses, not only just helping to navigate churches through the greatest communication shift in the past 500 years, but this notion of there are 167 more hours in the week that a church can serve, that many of our churches plan for an hour or two on a weekend. So what is to be done with the remaining 167 hours? Speak to us about how churches can lean into the opportunities that are in the rest of the time that we have during a week to minister.
Well, it all comes down to like what you're trying to accomplish at your church. And anytime I have a conversation like this, Richard, we can talk about the strategies, we can talk about the ins and outs of navigating different social platforms and things like that. But if those are separated from a foundation for what your church is trying to accomplish, then they're just going to be like aimless. Like you have to understand the trajectory that you want your church to get on. And because church is something that so many of us have been doing for so long, what happens is we can just get into the rhythm of doing church that it's easy for us to forget, well, what are we actually trying to accomplish at the end of the day? And so that's why we've been introducing and talking about this paradigm of next steps for the longest time. I think one of the reasons that when the pandemic hit, we were like, we can do all this online is because what we've been spending the majority of our creativity, money, efforts, and time on is something that we can do online. Listen to a pastor preach, listen to worship music. Sometimes I'll hear a church say, we believe circles are better than rows. And it's a statement that says, we believe that small groups matter more than being in church. But then we look at our budgets and we're like, do we really? We can see what you're spending your money on. And that's not really, I'm not even trying to poke fun or even critique churches in that way. We're in this transitional period where before the internet existed, the only way to really hear a message or get involved in worship through music was to go to that local in-person setting. Now, that's no longer true, but we're still putting most of our efforts into those types of things on a Sunday morning. We need to begin pivoting towards realizing that, okay, what can offline do that online cannot? The community side. What can online do that offline can also do? Well, we can teach. We can publish those types of things. We can record music and distribute it. And so we're kind of in this transitionary period where we're moving away from, we're like almost switching the positions of these two things. It all needs to be tied down to what your church is trying to accomplish. And the answer to that can't just be, we're trying to and you put in your mission statement basically, and it's a nice pithy mission statement. It's like, well, that's a great way of summarizing it, but what are you actually trying to accomplish? What does success look like at your church? And for most churches, it comes down to the Great Commission and the Greatest Commandment. So the Great Commission, of course, is to go out, make disciples, and the Greatest Commandments are to love God and to love your neighbor like yourself. And virtually every church exists for those purposes. And we'll take those ideas and we'll create maybe a pithy mission statement. But if those are the things that we're trying to do, then let's start working backwards from there. How do we fully accomplish that? It demands people getting involved. It demands next steps. So that's why we talk about this idea of next steps as what we should be optimizing for. And sometimes sometimes I'll use marketing language that people can get turned off by because it's very markety, like optimize for, like just we want more people taking next steps because it's a good thing, people taking steps towards Jesus. So then once that becomes what we want to do most, we can start listing them out. What are the next steps that we value most at our church? Maybe it's baptisms, maybe it's getting involved in small groups, maybe it's committing to giving to something, maybe it's serving. Attending a church service is frankly usually lower on that list, but it can definitely be one of the next steps. Once we care about, we've documented those next steps, now we can start creating strategies, programs, and ideas for getting more of those next steps to take place. So forgive me for getting on the kind of dodging your original question, but if the strategies and top-level stuff is not connected directly to the foundational parts, you're basically just, trying some fun strategies on social. You probably won't see many results from them because they weren't tied to something of substance.
Yeah. No, you actually kind of brought it full circle and landed perfectly, because I think that we've seen no shortage of examples where we've done the aesthetic work. A lot of us, my church included, prior to and even when this pandemic dawned, let's change logos and let's kind of get branding and let's get high quality equipment. Let's get lighting and all of these things have their place. But to remember that there's a mission and there's strategy. Like another thing that happened as a result of it is, and I'll speak for my particular faith community, everything goes online, your smaller and your bigger churches. And inevitably what happened, Brady, is a lot of the smaller churches are comparing themselves to the bigger churches. And they're saying, all of my members are watching the big church services. Now, many of these big churches, bro, like they're not local. It's not talking about, hey, my small church in Hampton is watching the big church in Williamsburg. No, it'll be like in a completely different state, right. On the other coast of the United States of America. Not knocking it. In many ways, I leaned in with my congregation and several of my peers said the same thing. We said to our members, this is the age we're living in. We understand that when we go live, whether you're using Ecamm, StreamYard, or whatever your streaming platform is, your viewership in many ways is not only viewing yours. They've got a service on their phone, on their iPad, on their television, on their computer. But here is where the challenge of comparison comes. One, we can get into, budget and personnel, but our members, this is what was meaningful for us. Our members, when they're in a crisis or like you said, a season of celebration, they are not contacting the big church in several states to the east or to the west and saying, hey, can you come to my kid's basketball game or can you come visit? They're calling you. So it had this way of helping us to realize that, almost going back to our previous question, that as much as we will have a chance to kind of look around and see what everyone else is doing, and that's not inherently bad. I think we can learn by observation, to always remember that there's still a local responsibility and privilege of service where we are. And I want to ask you, I'm sure in your work, you work with smaller and bigger churches. And is it possible for a church, no matter what their size, to be able to really get down to the bottom of, here's our mission, big picture, Great Commission, greatest commandments, and here's our local church strategy? Is it possible for that church, no matter their size, to, develop a system and strategy of communication that doesn't have to look like another church? Is that something that we can aspire towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong also with looking to other influential churches and gaining ideas from them, especially when we're talking about aesthetics. Aesthetics is something that's really easy to copy. And, one thing I believe about creativity is everything is a remix. There's nothing original. So when I'm getting creative myself, it's almost always a hybrid, a recipe like this, boiling pot of a bunch of different ideas that then I put together and then I present it in a way that's uniquely mine. Or by taking 3 different ideas and combining them, I create something that's somewhat different, or it has elements, ventricles of newness. And for an aesthetics, that's totally fine. You could look at any bigger church, influential church, and be like, man, their lighting is really interesting. I wonder if we could do that in our own setting. There's almost no harm done to that. The harm comes when you look at their strategies and then try to bring those into your own church thoughtlessly that's when you can get into doing more harm than good. So you might look at a bigger church and be like, interesting, they are not they're not showing their worship at all. Or let's say they are showing their worship. That's probably a better example. Okay, so they do their worship and then they bring their pastor on stage. It doesn't look like they have any announcements at all. Curious. And they have a host at the beginning. Okay, we need a host. We need to do our worship, and let's cut any like announcements. Let's go straight to the pastor, the preaching after the worship elements. And those are all decisions that they've made for strategic reasons that are in response to their unique audience and what they are in that season trying to accomplish. If you then bring those into your church and don't really examine them, don't really test them against, again, your own goals, the things you're trying to accomplish in this season, what often happens is that our churches just become these like carbon copies of 7 other churches, and we're just doing the things that we see bigger influential churches do, and we end up kind of being aimless because all of these different strategies are pulling us in different directions. And then we can look a year down the road and be like, did we really move forward as a church in any meaningful way? We saw these things happen forward. We saw these things happen backward. We're in a different place. I don't know if we're in a better place. It's kind of just the same. And that isn't to say that we always need forward momentum. You know, as much as we try dealing with faith and existential matters of faith in life, which is what we as churches do, is extremely complex. And because it involves people, you know, it's not as simple as numbers or dollars and cents. That's just not how it works. And so this isn't to say that you always need to be making forward progress like that. Again, that's not realistic. But if all we're doing is copying what other churches are doing strategically, that will never fully align with what we're doing strategically. And that can put you in a place where there are just more vulnerabilities. And I'll add one more thing. Like, this has been such a hard season for pastors. And it's easy to hear a podcast like this, and all I'm doing is being like, you know, you really shouldn't have copied Elevation. You really shouldn't have done that in that way. And they're like, man, like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm used to like caring for people by their hospital beds, and I've been preaching for 15 years, and I know how to do that. But then I had to live stream. I don't know. I just looked at what they were doing and I did it, and that's perfectly fine. Like, you know, there are so many times in our own lives where we're like, look, there's probably a better solution here, but I do not have the resources, the time, the energy to get there. So I'm just going to make do with what I have. You know, this is kind of like that period of when like you have a newborn. It's like, could I be eating better? Yeah, I probably could. But you know what? Right now, I just need this kid to sleep, and I'm on 4 hours average. Like, yeah, this pizza, the third slice, you're right, not ideal, but some things have to be sacrificed for us to survive right now, and I need some type of energy, and I can't cook. The pandemic period was kind of like that. That's okay for a season. But if we find ourselves there permanently, that's what we want to work against as much as possible.
You think a lot about tech, culture, church, and you could have very easily kind of privatized your learning, just kept it for your local church. At what point do you realize that all that I'm learning, I should probably share and teach? When did that happen for you?
So I'll go back to when I was studying to be a youth pastor. So I was in third year of Bible college, and I'm looking around at my peers. They'd go on to be lead pastors of really small rural churches in Canada, worship pastors, youth pastors. That's often where you start in the world of church. And, you know, it's 2010. Facebook's been around for 2 years. For many people, it's still very new. But as a younger person, I felt like I could fairly accurately predict the trajectory the culture was going. And I was like, you know, in a few years, if not a few months, it's my peers who studied to be worship pastors, studied to be student pastors. Their leadership's going to come to them and say, hey, can you like publish a Facebook page for us? Or can you spin up a website for us? And they're going to be the ones that are in charge of these things. And I was like, as a single person, I could create a company that like does these things for people, but the ideal endpoint is where we have these skills ourselves in our own ministries, and we're able to do this ourselves. And so I was like, what's actually better is for me to start a YouTube channel, start a podcast, start a blog. I picked up these skills not through formal education. I just picked them up through, you know, trial and error. And if I can do it, so can you, Pastor. So I just began teaching everything that I was learning. And then the strategic element of that, Richard, like, let's be clear, by teaching all of these things publicly and giving that away for free, it built trust within my industry. I built an audience. And thus, when I wanted to launch a product and start a business, I had an audience that trusted what I had to say because I had been helping them for so long. Then I said, hey, we have a software platform. You can build your website, which I taught you about, like the things that you need on your website. Well, we actually have a service for that. Like, use our software. So then when we launched that, 1,000 churches in the first week were like, yeah, we'll pay you for that, because I had built a foundation of an audience and they trusted me and they knew that I could help them. And so when there was a paid offering, sure, the vast majority were like, oh, that's great, but it's not right for us right now. But a minority of them were like, oh yeah, that is right for us. And they signed up. So I don't want it to sound like fully altruistic. There is a strategic element to the value of that.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I think that a large portion of listeners and viewers understand that even with inspiration, there comes strategy. So we're definitely tracking with you. I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a tangent connected to that, but maybe not so much connected to our overall conversation about church, and talk just briefly about content creation. You mentioned podcasting, blogging, YouTubing. And I know that many in our generation either have kind of taken a head dive into becoming content creators, or at least are casually interested in it. And we're definitely consumers of it. So I want to ask you, when it comes to content creation, I think there are a number of avatars we could present, but the one I want to talk about is there's a listener right now, a viewer, Brady, who is like deathly afraid to create content. I mean, they just look and on Facebook, on YouTube, they look on Spotify, Apple, whatever it is they're wanting to create. And they just seem like, there's no way that I could build a platform. And fear maybe just kind of causes them to pause. I'll be honest. I wanted to launch a podcast for years, wanted to do video blogging for years. And I would kind of say lip service, right? I would say, oh, I don't really know how to edit, and I don't have all the equipment, and, I don't have a microphone, got my Blue Yeti right here in front of me. Don't have all these things. But in the middle of it all, it was really just this lack of assurance. Can I really do it, and will it take off? What would you say, one, to that person who's kind of on the edges in fear, apprehension, and then to another person who's saying, I'm not afraid, I'm ready to go, but they just might not know that, listen, this takes a level of consistency. How have you developed this? Because I'm sure you're a human being like all of us. There are days where I'm sure you might not feel like, turning on the lights, setting up your shop, plugging in your microphone and pressing record. There are times where you might not have that feeling, that rush of inspiration that we all love to ride. And it's just kind of, this is on schedule. I'm going to do it. I've got a podcast interview. I've got a recorded video. I'm leading a team meeting. What would you say to those persons who want to become content creators, are afraid, or maybe don't have the staying power?
The important thing to remember is that every single one of us started in that same place. So you can go to my YouTube channel. It's just my name. It's my name on all the platforms, Brady Shearer. Type it in, go to my YouTube channel, go to videos on the YouTube tab, and then you can sort. Sort them from oldest to newest. By default, it's newest to oldest.
Yeah.
Watch my first videos from 10 years ago. Richard, for some reason, my chin is like pointed in the air. For those that are listening and not watching, like I'm looking, like my chin is up as if I feel like, a dignified person would show off their Adam's apple to the camera. What am I doing? I don't know. And I was 21 years old, and it was 2012, I think. YouTube was 7 years old at that point, but still such a baby. And I was a baby. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. And everyone starts that way. Like, no one starts and they're polished. And we're still in the very early ages of social. Like, it's easy to forget because it's such a huge, huge force in our lives that it feels like it's been here forever. It's been around for a decade. Like, social is the age of a really awkward teenager who is just hitting puberty. They're 11, 12, 13 years old. Like, sometimes they make sense, but then sometimes you're like, what are you doing? Like, that's where we're at. And so every single one of us doesn't know what we're doing even now. There's a draft for a YouTube video I'm writing right now. It'll go live in a couple weeks. And the working title is what I never wanted to tell you about social media. And the thesis of that video is basically I can give you some of the foundational principles, philosophies, and rules of social. But social is a dance. It's jazz. It's, to use a sports analogy, it's a pitcher and batter baseball relationship. The pitcher knows that they can throw really fast. They know that they can throw a slider, but they also know that the batter knows that. And so they need to kind of predict what they're expecting, the batter, and then the pitcher throws something and the batter's like, oh, that's what they're thinking, so I'll respond. And then the pitcher has to respond to that response, and this endless back and forth. It's not like basketball where I can stand at the free throw line and the basket doesn't move. It's 15 feet away, it's 10 feet in the air, and I can make sure to, okay, my elbow's in, my release is consistent, I'm holding my follow through. The net is not moving. Social is not that. Social is the pitcher and batter. And so the thesis of this video is like, guys, like, I thought, I never wanted to really tell you this. I can teach you these principles, but you can only really ever figure this out by doing it. And the only way to get there, to get to it, is to get through it. To use a cliche, like, you have to make some really junky content to ever hope you make better content. So the sooner you get the junky content out of the way, the sooner you'll get to the better content. So just start publishing. It's like lifting in the gym. You know, there are certain movements like the deadlift or the bench press, these complex movements, the squat, that you can watch YouTube videos about and you can read about proper form. But until you get under the bar and feel how your specific limbs, which are different lengths and different proportions than, let's say, the YouTube video you watched, and how it feels to hold that weight. So like, you line up for the deadlift and you're like, well, the person told me that my legs should be this far apart and my arms should be like this. But what I didn't know is that that person's arms are like 15% longer than mine compared to their other limbs. Preach. and so you have to just do it to figure out what works for you. And so it's not like a glamorous teaching. It's not something usually people want to hear. And we can learn the scales. I'm just analogies all over the place, Richard. We can learn the scales like on the guitar, on the piano. But eventually, once you've learned the scales, really to make something special is when you start improvising. And you work within the rules, but it's a solo. It's figuring it out. And then as soon as you have it figured out, TikTok comes. And you got to learn to do short form video. And there's different nuances to that culture. And then once you've got that figured out, something changes again. And so it's just a grind. You just got to keep publishing, keep working.
Listen, brother, I'm with you on analogies and illustrations and metaphors. I was right there with you.
As a pastor, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm over here getting excited. Like, yeah, that's it. That's social. Like, literally, there's a piano to my right. I was just watching the Mets and the Padres play those two separate games yesterday, all that stuff. And it's right there for us to kind of just ponder and imagine. And I'll say this, man, when the pandemic hit, my local church, we were having conversations about really kind of launching forward and establishing an online presence. But the pandemic just forced us to do that. Like, we were planning a month-long program, and back in March 2020, things shut down. I think on Thursday, my organizing body was saying, hey, listen, no more than 50 people at your church this weekend. Friday morning, they said no more than 10. Friday, 1 o'clock, they said, okay, shut it down. And of course, the rest is history. We couldn't have foreseen that it would go on this long. Well, the next weekend, I opened my computer, the very computer that's open right now, and I went live on Facebook, like native Facebook, just press Facebook Live. And I'm just, going for the fences, preaching, letting people know there's still hope. Same thing the next weekend, same thing the next weekend. 3 weeks past, Brady. And it's not until then that what I am seeing on my computer screen, I learned that what I'm seeing on my computer screen is not what people are seeing on theirs. I'm talking about the grainiest footage you've ever seen. If there's 360 and 240, it's probably less than that, right? I mean, I had no clue. They're saying, Pastor, we can hear you, but we cannot see you. So then we say, okay, we've got to fix that. And I can go on and on, like the quality of image, which might not even be the best there is. It in and of itself has been a journey. I can go back and look at some of those videos and say, man, like that was painful. This is before we even got StreamYard and other things. And a lot of that came in conversation with others. The other thing I'll say is we launched a weekly devotional on Instagram, Thursdays at noon. I go on Instagram Live, and just the whole premise is sharing a principle from a single verse of scripture. Well, the other day, my wife and I were kind of scrolling back through, looking at the very first one. And I could tell that I just wasn't comfortable. I'm like trying to say, hey, anybody in here? Come on in. You know how that is on Instagram Live. But now just did one today before we got on here. And one, the community has grown. but I've become more comfortable. I just shared these personal illustrations just to kind of connect with your thought. You got to go through it to get to it. You've got to endure and learn from and, appreciate the junk that inevitably comes as a part of this content creation journey to get to the quality stuff. And I'm grateful that you didn't become discouraged 10 years ago, but that you've continued on, because here we are today. I want to invite you to share with us. You've kind of given us some insight into pro church tools. And there's also another product called Nucleus. What is Nucleus and how are churches benefiting from it?
Yeah, so Nucleus is our software product. It's how our company makes money. We're a company of about 15 people, and 90% of what we do is, giving away content like this. You can check out our YouTube channel, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Just search my name, Brady Shearer, or search Pro Church Tools, which is our content creation side of the company. Our software platform, Nucleus, it's used by a few thousand churches. It's software to help your church build a website, software to help your church accept donations online, social media subscription, so you can download posts with the templates and publish them to your social pages. We like to think of that as a good supplement for what churches are already doing. If you're doing nothing, it's a great way to start. We like churches to post their own content on social, but social is a beast and you can really post as much as you want. And so it can be helpful to supplement that. Our subscription service helps with that. And so there are a number of different products within Nucleus, but the idea of everything we do is to have platforms and content that spurs on more next steps. That's what it's all about. Affecting life change, getting people to be involved. Social can play a role in that. Your website can play a role in that. Obviously, giving plays a role in that. And so building software is a lot of fun. It is really rewarding to build and create something from nothing that solves problems for churches. One of the cool parts of Nucleus Giving, the giving side of the platform, is that we don't take any fees for ourselves in the platform, which is what most giving companies do. And so we've processed now a couple $100 million in donations on that platform. And that means millions of dollars that would have gone to us or another giving company, if churches had chosen them, have stayed with the churches. And during a pandemic, we hear stories from churches that use the platform like, hey, we would have lost $3,000 this month to fees, but instead we got to keep that. And that was really great in a pandemic because it allowed us to buy a camera for the first time and we started live streaming and stuff. And so there's a lot of fun in building software. Nucleus.church is the URL. Real simple. You can check it out there. There's plenty of free trials too. No credit card required. So test drive, see what you like, and take it from there.
Definitely. We'll drop that in the show notes. And let me just commend you. I'm sure that this was a prayerful and decision that was born of prayer, but also conversation with your team to forego rev share, which a lot of giving platforms, kind of make money off of. Just on behalf of so many churches, I appreciate that. That's a sacrifice. And I know that you guys are going to be blessed because of it. There's a young person right now who sees a need in their church, but they do not have a title. They don't carry an official position, or maybe they just lack they doubt their own leadership acumen and ability to affect change. What would you say to that person in terms of either one, how to connect with their leaders to say, hey, I think there's an opportunity for change here, or how to develop the courage to lead that change themselves?
Yeah, so leading from a position of lower level is something I'm really passionate about. I'm only 30, and so my entire professional career has been leading from below in churches and then in the overall church industry. And the best thing that you can do is, first, when you go to your leader, go to the person in charge, is you want to clearly articulate their vision and what they're passionate about. So if Pastor Richard was your pastor and he was specifically he's like, man, we have this passion for reaching young men in Hampton, young men. We just care about that a ton in our church. So you go to Pastor Richard and you go, hey, I know we have this huge passion for reaching young men, and I really care about that. Here's one way I think we can fulfill that mission. And let's say your passion is videography in some way. And I think we could reach more young men in Hampton if we did this. And then that's when you present your idea and the thing that you're passionate about. The key, though, is that you don't just go to your senior leader and be like, here's what I'm passionate about. Because as a senior leader, that's what they hear all the time. Everyone in their church has an idea for what they care about and what they want to be done. To be different, to stand out, and to be a ally to your leader and not just someone that wants to suck resources from their perspective, is to say like, hey, this is what we care about, what we're trying to accomplish as a church, as an organization. Here's what I'm passionate about, and here's how I think we can do that. And then the key from there is, at the beginning, you need to find a way to execute on that with very little ask from your leadership. So don't go in with a big budget ask. Don't go in with a big time ask. Just kind of like get permission. Be like, is it cool if I kind of like try to experiment with this? And be like, yeah, I mean, a senior leader, you just articulated their vision, something they care about, and then you didn't ask them for anything? Yeah, sure, go for it. We'll take it from there. So then you have to prove, or at least demonstrate, that your theory, your hypothesis is correct. Once you've done that, and I'm condensing this this process, a process that was taught to me by a senior pastor. I cannot take credit. I asked him, I was like, hey, I'm not a senior pastor. How should someone do this? It should take place over, weeks, maybe months. You don't want to rush it either. Once you've demonstrated, proved that your idea can help accomplish the mission, then you can go in for a bit of an ask. So what you want to do is, let's say you're asking for, some gear. Let's say, hey, I did this with my phone. We got this accomplished. Do you think maybe we could invest in a camera here? So now you have an ask. Now the pastor, okay, they got to put budget aside. They got to put time aside, something like that. You want to basically present 3 different options, okay? So you present like the extreme budget option. You present the medium option. The key is, that's the option you actually want, okay? And then you present like the expensive option. So then you say, look, this budget option, might as well keep using my phone at that point. Like, yeah, we could pay for this, but like, there's virtually no leap that we can make here. But I just wanted to show that for you. This medium option, here's the thing. We don't have to spend that much. A lot of people think you need this expensive option, but I think we can get it done with this medium option. The medium option is the one that you want, though. So this is just anchoring. It's not disingenuous. It needs to be honest. Like, don't lie here. So like, actually say like, hey, there's a more expensive option, but like, it's only, let's say 10% better, but it's 10x as expensive, or it's 15% better, it's 3 times as expensive. Show that there is a middle of the road option that's enough. And then you can use those kind of 3 options as the anchoring. Now remember, it was a lead pastor that taught me this. So this isn't, disingenuous to present it in that way. But that's generally the process. And then once you have, let's say, the investment from the leadership side, they've given you a little budget, they've given you a little time. It can be something as simple as, oh, they've given you a position. You're now drumming on the worship team, right? Like, it doesn't always have to be budget for gear or something. You basically repeat the process again. And you do this month over month, year over year. And every time you put skin in the game yourself, tied to the mission of the organization, and prove that you can fulfill that, you've gained more trust. You've gained more equity. But you did it first. You put yourself on the line. You earned that trust. You earned that equity. And then it gets returned to you. If you've got good leadership, they need more allies. They need more people to help, and you've proven that you will, and then they're going to reward that.
Wow, that's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. I'm resisting the urge to respond to that with as much glee as I want to as a church leader, but I love it. And I think it's transportable. I think it's something that has a aspect of discipleship to it, but I think it also builds that relationship between a person and their church leader. Brady, I want to send us now on a rapid 3-minute countdown. I'm just going to throw some quick questions out there. First thing that comes to mind for you to respond to as we wrap up here. What gear goes with Brady all the time? When you're on the go, what gear do you have with you?
Oh, I have my phone, my wallet, and that's it. Don't take much gear with me anymore.
All right. So you're kind of a light traveler. All right, cool. Second question is, when there is no gear, this camera's off, lights are off, you're not in front of a microphone, what is Brady doing?
Brady's probably listening to a basketball podcast, figuring out where Ben Simmons is going to end up next. That's probably what I'm listening to. I love basketball. I'm a diehard Raptors fan. Been that way since 95 when we first started, 4 years old. Dad got me the program from the game, and I just became obsessed with the colors. I was 4. I mean, I couldn't understand too much about basketball, but I'm obsessed with the mascot and the colors. So yeah, huge sports fan, basketball, Raptors especially. I'm sure that Raptors championship was a dream come true in a major way here a few years ago. Last question is this, man. You can send yourself text message.
10 years into the future, what does it say?
In the future. Now, if I sent it 10 years in the past, it would have a lot of profound thoughts.
I'm sure it would.
So I send myself a text 10 years in the future, and then I can ask a question, I get an answer back? Or am I...
No. You're telling your future self something from now. You're sending yourself a text message. The you 10 years from now is getting a text message from the you right now. What does it say?
Oh, man. Probably something about like just, keeping the main thing, keeping your priorities straight. I mean, I'd probably try to squeeze in a question there, be like, hey, did the Raptors ever win again? Like, it's been 10 years. Like, did we ever get another shot? Like, did the Jays win? What's the price of Bitcoin? I don't know.
Right. Drop some secrets back on me, man, so I can look prophetic real quick.
Yeah,
exactly. Man, listen, Brady, bro, appreciate your time. Appreciate your sharing.
Sorry, just before, the reason I answer that question that way is like, every time I look back like a year or two, I'm always like, that kid knew nothing. So I presume I know nothing now. So even the thought that a 30-year-old Brady would even say anything to 40-year-old Brady, like aside from just reminding him, hey, family's important, taking care of your body's important, sleep is important. Like aside from things that I know are definitely never going to change, just the thought that a 30-year-old like myself could say anything to my 40-year-old is, I struggle with that, because I'd get that as a 40-year-old, but yeah, I bet you would think that you don't know anything.
Yeah. Even that's a powerful thought. Like the text message might say, I'm sorry for anything you're dealing with now. Because of-
That's it. There it is. That's the condensed version. I like that. We'll move forward with that.
Oh man, bro, I appreciate your time. Appreciate the hang and just chopping it up a bit. Hopefully it won't be the last time. And for our viewers and our listeners, I hope that if you were already acquainted with Brady, Pro Church Tools, Nucleus, that in some way you've been more encouraged. This is a difficult season, but there is a way forward. And if you have never heard of Brady, you've never heard of Pro Church, maybe you've kind of been on the fringes of church, or maybe you are part of that community whom we love very much. You said, listen, I've kind of just been out of Dodge, kind of checked out years ago, and you're a little bit more inspired to consider how you might be a part of the solution to some of the problems you know very well. And maybe you're somewhere in the gray area between those two. Wherever you fall, I hope that for the culture, for the tech community, and for the church space, we have grown a little bit more as we've listened and learned to this conversation. Check out the show notes for a lot of what we've talked about. Continue to listen to more of what Brady has to offer. I'm telling you, you will not be disappointed by the quality content Pro Church Tools is offering to help us navigate the greatest communication shift in the past 500 years. That's all we have for this episode of The Living Room. I'm your host, Richard Martin. Our special guest has been Brady Shearer. Until next time, continue to listen, continue to learn, and continue to live.